What if everything you've built, an empire of glass and steel, a fortune that could move mountains, was suddenly meaningless? For Julian Blackwood, owner of the world-renowned Elysian Grand Hotel chain, life was a series of calculated acquisitions and flawless strategies. He was a man who had everything and controlled it all. But in the gilded expanse of his own 5-star lobby, a chance encounter with a struggling waitress and her 5-year-old daughter would shatter his perfectly curated reality. It wasn't a business deal or a market crash that brought his world to a halt. It was a pair of familiar, slate-grey eyes, a mirror image of his own staring back at him from a child's face, and a single earth-shattering word she would cry out. The Elysian Grand in New York City was more than a hotel. It was Julian Blackwood's cathedral. Every inch of it, from the polished Italian marble floors that reflected the light of the 3-story chandelier like a captured constellation, to the faint, custom-blended scent of white tea and bergamot in the air, was a testament to his obsession with perfection. At 42, Julian had a reputation carved from granite. He was ruthless in the boardroom, demanding in his expectations, and emotionally inaccessible to everyone, including his beautiful and socially impeccable fiancée, Victoria Davenport. He wasn't supposed to be in the main dining room, the Viridian, during the Sunday brunch rush. His afternoons were for strategic calls and reviewing architectural plans for his new Dubai location. But a major food critic was rumored to be dining incognito, and Julian trusted no one's eyes but his own to ensure flawlessness. He stood near a marble column, a ghost in a bespoke Tom Ford suit. His presence, a silent, intense pressure that made the staff move a little faster, polish their glasses a little brighter. His gaze, sharp and analytical, swept the room. He noted a server whose posture was slightly slouched, a busboy who was a fraction too slow clearing a table. Then his eyes landed on a new waitress. He didn't recognize her, which was unusual. He prided himself on knowing the key staff at his flagship property. She was graceful, efficient, with a quiet dignity about her. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a severe professional bun, but a few rebellious wisps framed a face that was familiar. A faint nagging echo from a past he had long since buried under layers of success and ambition. He dismissed it. A trick of the light. He was about to turn away when the incident happened. A wealthy couple regulars were leaving with their young son, who was throwing a tantrum over a dropped toy. He ran backward, not looking, and collided hard with the waitress as she was carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. The tray crashed to the floor in a symphony of shattering glass. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry," the waitress gasped, immediately kneeling to pick up the larger pieces, her hands trembling slightly. The manager, a perpetually stressed man named Mr. Abernathy, rushed over his face. Pale. "Ma'am, are you all right, Mr. and Mrs. van der Sloot? My deepest apologies." But Julian's attention was no longer on the mess or the affronted guests. It was on the small figure who had just darted out from the staff entrance behind the kitchens. A little girl no older than 5 or 6, with the same vibrant auburn hair as the waitress tied in 2 slightly crooked pigtails. "Mommy," the girl cried, her voice a tiny bell in the suddenly quiet room. She ran towards the waitress. "Are you okay?" The waitress. Amelia looked up, her face a mixture of mortification and maternal concern. "Lily, honey, you need to stay in the break room. I'm fine, sweetheart. It was just an accident." Lily ignored her, her wide, worried eyes scanning the scene. And then her gaze drifted past the manager, past the angry guests, and locked directly onto Julian Blackwood, who was still standing by the column. Time seemed to slow. Julian felt a strange, inexplicable jolt, as if a circuit deep within him had suddenly been connected. The girl's face. It wasn't just the hair. It was the determined set of her small jaw, the distinct shape of her brow, and most of all her eyes. They were not her mother's warm, hazel eyes. They were a startling, crystal-clear slate-grey, flecked with silver. They were his eyes. He saw them every morning in the mirror. They were the Blackwood eyes, the same eyes his father had, a rare and dominant genetic trait that was the subject of family law. The world around him faded to a dull hum. The broken glass, the manager's frantic apologies, the impatient tapping of a designer shoe, it was all background noise. His entire universe had narrowed to the face of this small child. He took an involuntary step forward. He didn't know why. It was a magnetic pull, a force beyond his control. Lily's expression changed from worry to confusion, then to a strange, budding recognition. It was the kind of look a child gives when trying to place a face from a dream or a faded photograph. Her mother Amelia followed her daughter's gaze, and her blood ran cold. She saw him, Julian, after all these years, standing there like a king in his castle, looking exactly the same, only harder, colder. Panic seized her. She had to get Lily out of there. "Lily, come on, honey. Let's go," she whispered urgently, trying to pull her daughter back. But Lily didn't move. She kept staring at Julian, her little head tilted. He saw a flicker of his own impatient habit in the way she tapped her tiny finger against her leg. And then, in the cavernous, opulent silence of the Viridian dining room, her small voice rang out, clear and unwavering, with a word that detonated Julian Blackwood's life. "Dad." The word hung in the air, more fragile and yet more destructive than the shattered glass on the floor. "Dad." For a moment, the entire room was frozen. Mr. Abernathy's mouth hung open. The Vandersloots stared, their annoyance forgotten and replaced by salacious curiosity. Every diner within earshot had turned in their seat. Amelia's face went white as a sheet. "Lily, no." She choked out, scooping her daughter into her arms with a strength born of pure terror. "He's not. You're mistaken, baby." She turned to Julian, her eyes pleading and terrified. "I am so sorry, Mr. Blackwood. She doesn't have a father. She sometimes gets confused. I'm sorry." Without waiting for a response, she clutched Lily tight and fled through the staff doors, disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors of the hotel she worked in, but could never afford to be a guest at. Julian remained rooted to the spot. The child's voice echoed in his mind. Dad, it was absurd. A ridiculous, impossible coincidence. The girl's mother was a stranger. He hadn't seen her before. And yet, that flash of familiarity. The auburn hair, the curve of her smile, even in panic. And the girl's eyes. There was no denying the eyes. Victoria Davenport chose that moment to arrive, gliding towards him like a swan. "Julian, darling, I thought you were in your office. What was all that commotion?" Her eyes, a cool, calculating blue, scanned the scene, the lingering stares, the broken glass, Julian's unnervingly rigid posture. "Nothing," Julian said, his voice clipped and strained. "An employer-high accident." It seemed a bit more than that, she pressed, slipping her arm through his. "That little girl!" She shouted something. Julian pulled his arm away more sharply than he intended. "It was nothing. Let's go." He turned and strode towards the private elevator, his mind a chaotic storm. Victoria, momentarily taken aback by his coldness, quickly composed herself and followed her heels, clicking an angry rhythm on the marble. Up in the penthouse suite that served as his private office, Julian poured himself a scotch, his hand uncharacteristically unsteady. Victoria watched him, her expression a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Julian, talk to me. That waitress and her daughter. The girl called you father." She was confused, he snapped. "It's a baseless, ludicrous assertion. Is it?" Victoria asked softly, her tone laced with insinuation. "You looked rattled." "Do you know that woman?" Julian stared into the amber liquid in his glass. The past was a locked room, but the girl's voice was the key turning the tumblers one by one. Amelia Rose. It couldn't be. The summer he was 22, before his father's ultimatum, before Blackwood Industries became his entire world. A summer spent managing one of his family's smaller, now sold coastal properties. Amelia had been a local girl, working the front desk full of life and laughter that had briefly chipped away at his cynical armor. It was a whirlwind romance, intense and reckless, and it had ended as abruptly as it began. He had to return to New York, to his destiny. He'd said things about not being tied down, about the path he had to walk alone. She had overheard him talking to his father on the phone, a conversation about legacy and sacrifice. The next morning, she was gone. No note, no forwarding address, just an empty space where she had been. He'd been hurt then, angry, and finally he'd buried it. She was a summer fling. 20 years ago, he finally admitted the words tasting like ash. "It's impossible." "Is it?" Victoria repeated, her voice turning sharp. "A struggling waitress with a daughter who just so happens to look like you working in your flagship hotel, and the child just so happens to cry 'Dad' in the middle of a packed dining room. Julian, you're a brilliant businessman. Analyze the data. This is not a coincidence. It's a setup. She's a gold digger, and she's been planning this." The word gold digger resonated with his darkest, most cynical instincts. It was the world he knew. People were always after his money, his name. Victoria was voicing the logical protective conclusion his own mind was trying to reach. It was far more plausible than the alternative. Find out everything about her. Julian commanded his head of security, a former Mossad agent named Ben Carter, over the phone a few minutes later. Amelia Rose. I want her work history, her financial records, her personal life. Everything. And I want her in my office. Now. An hour later, Amelia stood before his vast mahogany desk. She had changed out of her uniform into simple jeans and a worn sweater. She looked small and fragile in the cavernous office, with its panoramic views of Central Park. But her eyes, though red-rimmed, were defiant. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice, quiet but steady. Don't he cut her off, his tone glacial? "Let's dispense with the pleasantries." "How much do you want?" Amelia flinched as if he'd slapped her. "How much?" "What are you talking about?" "The act in the dining room, the performance by your daughter. It was very effective, so let's hear the number. How much will it take for you and your fabricated story to disappear?" Tears welled in her eyes, born of shock and profound hurt. "You think I planned that? You think I would use my daughter like that?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. "My God, Julian. I knew you'd become hard, but I never thought you'd become cruel." The use of his first name, so familiar and yet so foreign from her lips, sent another crack through his composure. "I'm not playing games, Amelia. You appear out of nowhere, after 2 decades, get a job at my hotel, and orchestrate a public spectacle. What else am I supposed to think? I took this job because it offered the best pay and health insurance in the city, and I need both for Lily. I didn't even know you were still involved with this specific hotel until after I was hired. I prayed I'd never run into you. And Lily, she saw a picture, Julian. One picture. An old one I kept of you and me from that summer. She found it once. I told her it was her dad, but that he was far away and we couldn't see him. That's all. She's a child. She saw your face and she remembered the photo. Julian's fortress of denial began to crumble. It was too specific, too painful to be a lie. But Victoria's words echoed in his head. "Analyze the data. I don't believe in stories," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I believe in proof. There is only one way to settle this." He slid a business card across the desk. "This is the name of a private lab. My lawyer will arrange an appointment. We will conduct a paternal DNA test. If the child is mine, I will meet my financial obligations. If she is not, I will have you removed from my property and ensure you never work in this city again." Amelia stared at him, her heart shattering. He wasn't the boy she had loved. He was a cold, transactional stranger. There was no flicker of warmth, no question of what they once had. Just a threat, and a demand for biological proof. "Fine," she whispered, picking up the card. "You'll have your proof." The days that followed the sterile, silent appointment at the DNA lab were a form of exquisite torture for Julian. The public face of Julian Blackwood remained unchanged. He chaired meetings, finalized a multi-billion-dollar merger with the Davenport Hotel dynasty, a deal primarily brokered by Victoria's father, and exuded an aura of untouchable control. But privately, his world had tilted on its axis. His penthouse, once a sanctuary of order and quiet ambition, felt haunted. Every reflective surface seemed to throw back an image of the little girl's face. Lily. Her name was Lily. He found himself wandering the vast, empty rooms at night, the untouched scotch in his hand, his mind replaying the scene in the dining room over and over. What war? The logical part of his brain, the part that had built his empire, warred constantly with a new, unfamiliar ache in his chest. Victoria's theory was clean, simple, and fit the cynical worldview he'd adopted as a shield. Amelia was an opportunist. It was a corporate shakedown with a child as leverage. But then he would remember the look in Amelia's eyes in his office, not of greed, but of profound, soul-deep hurt. And he would remember the feel of her hand in his 20 years ago on a moonlit beach in Montauk. He remembered the sound of her laugh, a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed until the memory of it ambushed him in the dead of night. He pulled out an old, dust-covered photo album from the back of a closet one, from before he became Julian Blackwood CEO. And there it was. A faded picture of a much younger, smiling version of himself, his arm around a radiant Amelia. Her hair was down, blowing in the sea breeze. They were both tanned, carefree, and foolishly in love. He stared at his own face in the photograph. The man in that picture could have been a father. He might have wanted it. But that man was a stranger to him now. Frustrated, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Marcus," he said, when the call was answered. Marcus Thorne, now a successful novelist, living a quiet life in Vermont, had been his closest friend that summer. He was the only person who had known the real story of Julian and Amelia. "Jules, to what do I owe the honor?" Did a skyscraper finally grow a heart? Marcus's voice was as wry and familiar as ever. Julian didn't waste time with pleasantries. He recounted the entire story, the waitress, the girl, the eyes, the DNA test. He laid out the facts like a business case, his voice stripped of emotion. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "And you think she's lying?" Marcus finally asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "The evidence is circumstantial. The timing is convenient," Julian recited, sounding more like his lawyer than himself. "Evidence, Julian, for God's sake, listen to yourself. We're talking about Amelia Rose. Do you remember her? The girl who would cry watching ASPCA commercials. The one who returned a wallet with $500 in it when she was broke. She wasn't capable of that kind of deceit then." and I doubt 20 years has turned her into some master manipulator. People change, Julian said flatly. Some do. Marcus conceded. You did. But tell me this. Do you remember the last night you saw her, the night before you left Montauk? Julian's jaw tightened. I remember. Do you remember being on the phone with your father? I was there, Jules, on the porch. I heard you. You were shouting. You said, and I quote, "This summer was a mistake. I can't have attachments. I can't be tied down by a girl from a small town when I have an empire to build." You told him she meant nothing. The memory hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. He had said those things. He'd been young, arrogant, terrified of his father's disapproval, and overwhelmed by the weight of his future. He'd been trying to convince his father, and maybe himself, that he was ready to make the necessary sacrifices. She was standing in the hallway, Marcus said softly. She heard it all. I saw her face before she turned and ran. You didn't just leave, Julian. You shattered her. She didn't disappear for money. She ran to save what was left of her heart. The phone felt heavy as lead in Julian's hand. The clean, simple narrative Victoria had provided was now tangled and messy. He had not been the victim of a youthful fling's abandonment. He had been the cause. He had driven her away with his cold, ambitious words. And if she was pregnant then, she would have believed with absolute certainty that he wanted nothing to do with her or their child. She had run not to trap him, but to free him. He hung up the phone, the silence of the penthouse pressing in on him. He looked at the old photograph again. The smiling man looked back a silent accusation. For the first time in 2 decades, Julian Blackwood felt a crack in his armor, not of suspicion, but of a vast and hollow regret. The results of the DNA test were no longer just a business transaction. They were a verdict on his entire life. Victoria Davenport was no fool. She had felt the shift in Julian the moment the waitress and her child had appeared. He was distracted, distant the impenetrable wall around him, showing hairline fractures. The Davenport-Blackwood merger was on the line, a union that would create the largest luxury hotel conglomerate in the world. More than that, her own position, her future as Mrs. Julian Blackwood was at stake. This Amelia Rose was not just a loose end from the past. She was a lit fuse. Victoria knew Julian. She knew his logic, his cynicism, and his deep-seated distrust of emotional entanglement. These were the levers she needed to pull. She began her campaign subtly. She hired a private investigator of her own, a man far less scrupulous than Julian's Ben Carter. The report she received back on Amelia Rose was exactly what she'd hoped for a life of struggle. Amelia had moved around a lot, after leaving Montauk working a series of low-paying jobs to support herself and her daughter. There were periods of debt and near eviction a few years back, and no record of any significant romantic relationships. Victoria artfully curated this information. I had my father's people look into her, darling, she said to Julian one evening, handing him a sleek, leather-bound folder as they sat in his penthouse. I was just so worried for you. I wanted to be sure. Julian opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, showing low balances, credit reports flagged with late payments, and a list of previous non-glamorous jobs. It was a portrait of financial desperation. Look at this, Victoria said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at a line item. She took out a high-interest payday loan just 6 months ago. She's clearly been in dire straits for a long time. And then suddenly she gets a job at the flagship Elysian Grand. It's too perfect, Julian. He felt a knot of his old suspicion tighten in his gut. Marcus's words had shaken him, but this was hard data. Numbers. Facts. This was the language he understood. The story about the photograph is sweet. Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. But it's just that a story, a convenient narrative to explain an incredible coincidence. What's more likely that a child's blurry memory of a 20-year-old photo sparked a public outburst, or that a desperate woman coached her daughter on what to do and who to point at when the moment was right? Her words were poison, seeping into the cracks of his doubt. He wanted to believe in the Amelia he remembered, but the man he was now couldn't ignore the file in his hands. Victoria, sensing his wavering, decided on a more direct approach. The next day, while Amelia was on her lunch break, she found her in the staff cafeteria. The contrast between the two women was stark. Victoria in a Chanel power suit that cost more than Amelia's car, Amelia in her simple waitress uniform. Amelia Victoria began her smile as bright and cold as a winter morning. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Victoria Davenport." Julian's fiancée. Amelia's heart sank. She simply nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'm sure this has all been very overwhelming for you," Victoria said, leaning against the table. "And for Julian. He's a very private man. This kind of public drama is something he abhors." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "I've seen your file. I know you've had a difficult time. Raising a child alone is admirable, but it's clearly been a struggle." "My life is none of your business," Amelia said, her voice quiet but firm. "Oh, but it is," Victoria purred. "Anything that affects Julian affects me, and this affects him deeply. Which is why I'm here to offer you a solution. A way for you and your daughter to have a fresh start, far away from all this unpleasantness." She slid a pristine white envelope across the table. "There's a cashier's check in there for $250,000, enough for a down payment on a house and new car to set you up comfortably in another state. All you have to do is sign a simple non-disclosure agreement and withdraw your claim. Disappear. For good." Amelia stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the offer made her feel sick. This woman, and by extension Julian, believed she could be bought, that her daughter's identity had a price tag. "My daughter is not a claim," Amelia said, her eyes flashing with a fire Victoria hadn't expected. "And she is not for sale." She pushed the envelope back across the table. "Now, if you'll excuse me, my break is over." She stood up and walked away, her back straight, leaving Victoria staring at the rejected offer. The polite facade dropped from Victoria's face, replaced by a look of cold fury. The waitress had pride. That made her more dangerous. If logic and money wouldn't work, she would have to ensure the proof Julian was waiting for told the story she wanted it to. That afternoon, Victoria made a call to a man she knew, a man who ran a high-end private medical lab and owed the Davenport family a significant favor. "Dr. Alistair Finch," she said, when he answered. "I have a delicate matter I need your assistance with. It concerns a pending paternity test for Julian Blackwood, and it is imperative for everyone involved that the result comes back negative." The call came on a Tuesday morning. Julian was in a board meeting, dissecting quarterly earnings reports with brutal precision when his private line buzzed. It was his lawyer, David Chen. "The results are in, Julian." David said, his voice, its usual dry, professional monotone. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs, a betrayal of his calm exterior. "Email them to me," he commanded, and hung up. He stared at the tablet in front of him, the earnings charts blurring into meaningless colors. A new email notification popped up. The subject line was chillingly simple. "Blackwood paternity test results. Urgent and confidential." His hand trembled slightly as he tapped it open. He scanned the technical jargon, the genetic markers, the allele frequencies, until he found the final conclusive statement at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 0% conclusion. Julian Blackwood is excluded as the biological father of the child, Lily Rose. The air left his lungs in a silent rush. For a single dizzying moment, he felt an overwhelming wave of relief. The problem was gone. The complication was eliminated. Victoria was right. It had all been a scam, a sophisticated, emotionally manipulative lie. But the relief was immediately consumed by a colder, heavier emotion. It was a bitter, searing anger, mixed with a profound and inexplicable sense of loss. He had allowed himself, even for a moment, to entertain the possibility. He had let the echoes of the past disturb his present. He had been a fool. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "The meeting is over," he announced to the stunned boardroom. "We'll reconvene tomorrow." Without another word, he strode out. He didn't go to his office. He went straight to the staff levels of the hotel, his rage a storm cloud around him. He found Amelia in the employee break room, wiping down a table. He didn't bother to close the door. "Congratulations," he said, his voice dripping with ice. It was a valiant effort. Truly. Amelia looked up, confused. "What are you talking about?" He tossed his tablet onto the table in front of her. The screen glowed with the damning report. "The results are in. 0%. All that drama, the tears, the little girl's coached performance, all for nothing." Amelia stared at the screen, her eyes scanning the words. Her face drained of all color. "No," she whispered. It was a sound of pure disbelief. "No, that's not possible. That's a mistake. It has to be a mistake. The only mistake was mine, for ever wasting a second of my time on this." Julian sneered, his hurt manifesting as cruelty. "I believed you for a moment. I actually thought—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Tears streamed down Amelia's face. "It's a lie, I don't know how, but that is a lie. Lily is your daughter. Julian, I swear it on my life." "Your life?" He scoffed, his laughter harsh and empty. "What is that worth exactly? I have the file on you, Amelia. The debt, the desperation. It all makes perfect sense now. You saw an opportunity, a lottery ticket from 20 years ago, and you decided to cash it in. But you failed." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I told you what would happen. Pack your things. My security will escort you off the premises. You have 1 hour. If I ever see you or your daughter on my property again, I will call the police." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, the tablet glowing with the scientific proof of her lie. The other staff members in the room averted their eyes, whispering amongst themselves. In that moment, Amelia had never felt more alone. She was not just fired. She was branded a liar, a fraud, a manipulative charlatan. She stumbled back to the small, cramped apartment she shared with Lily, her body numb with shock. How could this happen? She had never been with another man. There was no other possibility. The test was wrong. Someone had lied. Someone had cheated. But who and why? She sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. She had no job, no money, and the man she had once loved, the father of her child, now looked at her with nothing but contempt. In his penthouse, Julian poured himself the stiffest drink he could find and called Victoria. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "You were right about everything." "Oh, darling." Victoria's voice flowed through the phone, a soothing balm of vindication. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. But now we can finally put it behind us. The merger announcement is next week. Our future is waiting." He looked out at the glittering city skyline, a kingdom he had built. He had won. He had exposed the lie and protected his empire. So why did it feel so profoundly, devastatingly like he had lost? In the week that followed, Julian threw himself back into his work with a vengeance. He was ruthless, efficient, and utterly miserable. The Amelia problem was solved. He had the irrefutable scientific proof. He should have felt vindicated, but instead, a leaden weight had settled in his soul. Victoria was ecstatic. She filled his schedule with wedding planners, caterers, and press interviews about the merger. She was cementing their future brick by perfect brick. "Isn't it wonderful, darling?" she would say. No more distractions. But the distractions were everywhere. He'd be in a meeting and would suddenly see a flash of auburn pigtails. He'd hear a child laugh in the park below his window, and his stomach would clench. One night, while reviewing security reports, he saw footage of Amelia being escorted from the building by 2 guards, her face a mask of tear-streaked devastation. He slammed the laptop shut, a feeling akin to nausea rising in his throat. The unraveling began with a single insignificant detail. He was signing off on a new line of patisserie for the hotel's cafes. The head chef presented him with a sample of a new creation, a lemon tart with a blueberry compote. "It's a classic pairing, Mr. Blackwood," the chef said. "Sweet and tart, very sophisticated." Julian took a bite and froze. A memory sharp and vivid cut through the fog of his anger. Montauk, a rickety porch swing. Amelia laughing, her mouth stained purple from the blueberries she was eating. He had been eating a lemon sorbet. "This is the best combination," she had said. "Sweet and sour. Just like us." It was a small, intimate detail, not something a grifter could research. How would she know he pushed the thought away? But it was a loose thread, and his mind, analytical and relentless, couldn't help but pull on it. He called David Chen, his lawyer. "David, I want you to do something for me. Quietly. I want you to look into the lab that ran the DNA test. Finch Diagnostics. Check their credentials, their history, any red flags." "Julian, the result was conclusive," David said, confused. "Is there a reason to doubt it? Humor me," Julian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. 2 days later, David called back. "It's interesting," he said, and David Chen did not use the word interesting lightly. Finch Diagnostics is a legitimate, high-end lab, but they've had 2 malpractice suits against them in the last 5 years, both settled out of court. Both involved allegations of sample contamination. And get this, the lab's parent company received a major infusion of capital 2 years ago from a venture fund primarily owned by Davenport Industries. The thread was now a rope. Davenport Industries, Victoria's family. A cold dread began to creep up Julian's spine. He thought back to Victoria's behavior, her immediate certainty that it was a scam, the conveniently compiled file on Amelia's financial struggles, her calm, triumphant demeanor when he told her the results. He needed more. He needed to talk to the one person who could confirm the truth of the past. He flew his private jet to Burlington, Vermont, and drove to Marcus Thorne's secluded lakeside home. Marcus listened without interruption as Julian recounted everything, including the negative DNA test and his brutal dismissal of Amelia. When he finished, Marcus just shook his head slowly. "You're a fool, Jules. A brilliant, wealthy, powerful fool," he said, his voice tinged with disappointment. "You let your fiancé and your trust issues blind you to the one truth that was staring you in the face. The test, Marcus. The science," Julian began, but his own words sounded hollow. "Science is only as good as the people interpreting it, or the people who have access to it," Marcus said pointedly. "Victoria Davenport has everything to lose if that little girl is yours. A prenup can protect your money, but it can't protect your name or your legacy from a scandal right before the biggest merger of your career. Her family would never stand for it." Marcus then told Julian something he had never shared. The morning Amelia left Montauk, She came to see me first. She was devastated, Julian. She told me she was pregnant. She made me swear I'd never tell you. She said she'd heard what you said to your father, that you saw her as a roadblock to your destiny. She said the kindest thing she could do for the man she loved was to disappear, to not be that roadblock. The world tilted. The truth in its agonizing simplicity was like a physical blow. She hadn't run from him. She had sacrificed her own happiness for what she thought was his. She had spent 20 years raising his daughter, alone, protecting him from a burden he had unknowingly created, and he had repaid her with accusations, cruelty, and public humiliation. The drive back to the airport was a blur. The carefully constructed world of Julian Blackwood, the empire built on logic and control, had been a prison of his own making. He had traded love for legacy, and in his paranoia, he had almost lost both forever. Back in New York, David Chen called with the final piece of the puzzle. I got a tip from a disgruntled technician who recently quit Finch Diagnostics. He was willing to talk for a price. He said the lab director, Alistair Finch himself, personally oversaw the Blackwood sample. He claims Finch switched the sample vial with a pre-prepared one from an anonymous donor before it was processed. The tech didn't know why, but he knew it was unethical. Julian hung up the phone. He now had the full, ugly picture. This wasn't just a lie. It was a calculated, malicious act of deception orchestrated by the woman he was about to marry. The cold anger he felt was different now. It was not the hot, defensive rage he'd felt towards Amelia. This was a precise Arctic fury. It was time for the reckoning. Julian returned to his penthouse late that afternoon. The air was still heavy with the scent of lilies and roses from a ridiculously large floral arrangement being positioned in the foyer. Victoria was there, a general directing her troops overseeing the preparations for their upcoming engagement party. She was radiant in a cream-colored dress, the very picture of triumphant high society, a woman who had successfully eliminated a threat and was now claiming her spoils. "Darling, you're back," she chirped, gliding over to kiss his cheek. The gesture felt alien, a cold press of skin. "What do you think? The florist was insistent on lilies, but I think the classic romance of roses is more appropriate for the main entrance, don't you?" Neither Julian said. His voice was unnervingly calm, devoid of any warmth, and it stopped her cold. He gestured with his head towards the living area, with its panoramic view of the city, now shrouded in the grey light of dusk. "Victoria, we need to talk." He remained standing as she perched uncertainly on the edge of the pristine, white leather sofa, her poise faltering for the first time. He preferred to stand. It felt like a courtroom, and he was finally ready to deliver the verdict. "We need to talk about Finch Diagnostics." He began, letting the name hang in the air between them. A flicker of pure, unadulterated panic flashed in her eyes, so brief it was almost imperceptible, immediately masked by a practiced look of concerned confusion. "The lab. What about it, Julian? They did their job splendidly. They proved what I knew all along. They protected you from that awful woman's scheme." "Oh, they did a job all right," Julian agreed, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. He began to pace slowly like a predator circling its cornered prey. "A very specific job. The job you commissioned, the one your family's hefty investment in Dr. Finch's parent company made it so easy to secure." Victoria's laugh was brittle, a shard of glass. "What are you talking about? My father invests in hundreds of ventures. It's a coincidence. You're not making any sense." "Let me make it perfectly clear for you," he said, stopping directly in front of her. He began to lay out the evidence piece by damning piece. David's research into the lab's malpractice history, the undeniable financial link to Davenport Industries, and the final irrefutable nail in the coffin. I spoke to a lab technician, Victoria, a man who recently quit. He remembers your name being mentioned by Dr. Finch. He remembers being told to leave the Blackwood sample for the director to handle personally. And he remembers seeing the director switch the vial with another one from a refrigerated drawer before it was ever processed. Her face, a masterpiece of cosmetic perfection, finally began to crumble. A disgruntled employee. That's your proof you're listening to the ramblings of some low-level worker who was probably fired for incompetence. Julian, think about who you're believing over me. Over your fiancé. He wasn't the only one I spoke to. Julian continued his voice, relentless. I flew to Vermont. I spoke with Marcus Thorne. He was there, Victoria, 20 years ago. He was there the night Amelia left. He told me everything. He told me she was pregnant when she fled, and he told me why she ran. He took a step closer, his slate-grey eyes boring into hers. She ran because she overheard me on the phone with my father, saying I couldn't be tied down, that she meant nothing. Arrogant, foolish words from a scared boy trying to sound like a man. She didn't leave to trap me later. She left to unburden me. She spent 2 decades raising my daughter alone in poverty to protect my destiny. The full, ugly truth of her deception was exposed, leaving no room for lies. Victoria abandoned her pretense of innocence and shifted to justification. Her expression hardened. All right, so I made sure the test said what it needed to say. I did it for us, Julian. That woman and her child were a bomb set to go off in the middle of our lives. Think of the scandal, the press right before the merger. My family, your board, they would have been furious. I did what was necessary to protect our future, our empire, our empire. The words dripped with contempt. This was never about us. This was about a merger. It was about you securing your position and your family acquiring half of my company through marriage. You didn't do this to protect me. You did it to protect your deal. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and saw not the elegant, ambitious partner he'd thought she was, but a hollow stranger, a woman whose moral compass was so broken she couldn't see the depravity of her own actions. You saw a 5-year-old girl not as a child, but as a liability to be neutralized. You didn't just lie, Victoria. You tried to erase my daughter. He spoke the words "my daughter" with a fierce, protective certainty that was entirely new. It was the sound of a fundamental shift deep within his soul. The merger is off. Effective immediately, he stated each word a hammer blow. Our engagement is over. My lawyer will be in contact with your father's legal team. I suggest you call him. He turned his back on her, a gesture of final, absolute dismissal. My security team is on their way up. They will escort you out. Your things will be sent to your apartment tomorrow. You can't do this. She shrieked, her voice raw with fury and disbelief. I won't let you. My father will ruin you. He'll start a corporate war, and he will burn your precious Blackwood empire to the ground. Julian paused at the door of his study, looking back at her one last time, a flicker of pity in his eyes. Let him try, he said, his voice weary but resolute. I've spent my entire life building one empire. It's time I started fighting for the one that actually matters. He closed the study door behind him, leaving her alone with the scent of dying flowers and the ruins of her ambitions. He didn't wait for the guards. He had a 20-year-old mistake to correct, and he had already wasted too much time. The drive to the motel in Queens was the longest of his life. With every passing mile that took him further from his world of sterile luxury and deeper into the gritty reality of the city, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He wasn't afraid of Amelia's anger. He deserved it. He was terrified of her indifference. What if he was too late? What if the damage was too complete, the wound too deep to ever be healed? He saw Lily's face in his mind, the confusion, the hope, and then the inevitable disappointment she must have felt. He had not just failed the woman he once loved. He had failed a child. His child. When his Maybach, a silent black vessel of obscene wealth, pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of the Starlight Motel, he saw her. Amelia was loading a worn suitcase into the trunk of a beat-up sedan, its paint faded and peeling. Lily was sitting on the curb nearby, listlessly drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Amelia's movements were heavy with exhaustion and defeat. She was preparing to run again, just as she had 20 years ago. His heart broke. He got out of the car, and the sound of the heavy door clicking shut made her look up. Her first reaction was a jolt of fear. She instinctively moved to stand in front of Lily, a lioness shielding her cub from the predator who had attacked them before. Julian held up his hands in a gesture of surrender and walked towards her, slowly stopping a dozen feet away. His bespoke suit felt like a costume, a ridiculous armor from a life that no longer felt real. "Amelia," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Please don't run." "Don't. Why are you here, Julian?" she asked, her voice flat, stripped of all warmth. "To gloat? To make sure we're really leaving? We are. You got what you wanted?" "No," he said, shaking his head, his eyes pleading. "I'm here because I was wrong. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I know everything." He told her all of it, the words tumbling out in a torrent of regret. He explained Victoria's malicious deception, the tampered test his own blinding paranoia. He didn't spare himself. He relayed Marcus's story, his voice cracking, as he recounted the words she had overheard all those years ago. "I was trying to convince my father. I was the ruthless heir he wanted me to be." He confessed, his gaze fixed on her face, searching for any sign of belief. "In trying to sound like him, I became a monster to you. I never meant those words, Amelia. Not about you. You were the only real thing in my life, and I was too much of a coward to admit it." Her stony expression softened just slightly. The anger in her eyes was being replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. "You humiliated me, Julian," she whispered, the pain of the last week raw in her voice. "You looked at my child, our child, and you called her a performance. You had me thrown out like a piece of trash. A phone call telling me you were wrong doesn't just erase that." "I know it doesn't," he said, taking another step closer. Tears were now streaming freely down his face, washing away decades of guarded pride. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I only ask for a chance to earn it." From behind, her mother, Lily, stepped out. She had been listening, her little face scrunched in concentration. She looked at the tall man who was crying, then up at her mother. Julian's attention shifted entirely to her. He knelt, sinking onto the dirty asphalt, ignoring the grime staining his $1,000 trousers. He brought himself down to her level. His entire world narrowed to this small, miraculous person. "Hello, Lily," he said softly. Lily looked at him, her slate-grey eyes, so much like his own, filled with a child's simple, devastating honesty. "Are you my dad?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "For real this time, yes." Julian choked out his heart, fracturing and healing all at once. "Yes, sweetheart. I am. For real this time. And I am so sorry it took me so long to find my way back to you." Lily studied his face for a long moment, as if judging the truth in his soul. Then she did something that shattered the last remnant of the cold, cynical billionaire. She closed the distance between them, wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, and squeezed with all her might. "It's okay," she whispered into his shoulder, her breath warm against his skin. "Mommy says sometimes people get lost, and they need help finding the map." In the grimy parking lot of a forgotten motel, Julian Blackwood held his daughter for the very first time. He buried his face in her auburn hair, which smelled of cheap motel soap, and something indefinably wonderfully Lily and he sobbed. He sobbed for the lost years, for his own stupidity, for the incredible undeserved grace of this moment. He felt Amelia's hand rest gently on his back, a silent offering of truce, of a possibility for a new beginning. Later, as they drove away from the Starlight Motel, leaving Amelia's broken-down car behind, like a shed skin, Lily fell asleep in the back of the Maybach, her head pillowed on a cashmere throw. Julian looked at Amelia in the soft glow of the dashboard lights. The silence between them was no longer filled with anger or pain, but with the fragile potential of a shared future. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "But we're going together." The empire of glass and steel he had built across the globe suddenly seemed like a collection of empty monuments. On that day, as he drove his family away from the wreckage of the past, Julian began the slow, painstaking work of building a new empire. This one wouldn't be measured in profit margins or property values, but in bedtime, stories, scraped knees, and the extraordinary, terrifying, beautiful business of being a father. The story of Julian, Amelia, and Lily reminds us that the most valuable assets we can ever have aren't listed on the stock market. They are the connections we forge, the truths we're brave enough to face, and the second chances we're humble enough to accept. Julian Blackwood had to lose his perfectly controlled world to gain a life filled with real meaning. He learned that a child's hug is worth more than any skyscraper, and that true love is a currency that never devalues. Their journey was one of heartache and betrayal, but ultimately, it's a powerful testament to the enduring strength of family. If this story of a love lost and a family found touched your heart, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story of redemption and hope, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next unforgettable real-life drama. Thank you for watching.